what Robert Bremen said.
As if we understand Marx better than the guy that wrote the introduction to essays on Marxist theories of value. That, you know what? This, I'm happy to, Dan and I haven't spoken. I'll give the listeners a quick background. We had a plan to read some I already forgot Robert Kurz. Is that his name? Okay. People who know who I mean, they'll know who I mean. German value theorist guy. We had some plan to read him over the past 2 weeks, but it wound up being quite dense. And Dan, thank God you texted me. You were like 2 days ago. You were like, "So how you getting on with the Kurz?" And I was like, "I have not started it. I'm panicking. I'm not going to be able to do this."
I think we were both kind of like hoping the other one would be the one that said, "Let's just not do this."
Let's just do something else.
Instead, we were both very kind of like, "But if you feel like if you want to do it."
I did say at one point, I was like, more than happy to keep doing it. And then you were like, maybe we save it for another time. And I was like, thank God. So we wound up not doing that. And I, in a panic, was like, what's open in my tabs on my website? And there was this essay. I no idea where I saw it recommended. It's Fredy Perlman, The Continuing Appeal of Nationalism. I didn't look at it as much as I should have, which isn't to say this is necessarily bad. I just think might be a short episode is what we're going to say. It might be a short. I don't know how much meat there is on this bone. But yeah, listener, that's why we're reading this. Basically, this is a truncated version of what we always do when we don't have anything to read, which is either read an anarchist or read an ultra-leftist. But when you read an anarchist, it's always Murray Bookchin. This is just an anarchist. So,
yes, something else. I'm just wondering whether I should see whether you're happy with your microphone. I don't really know whether it sounds good or right or not.
I think, yeah,
you're on the right one. I just had this lingering question, and I'd hate to get to the end again.
Well, you and I both have like a 6-year-old pair of headphones or earbuds that we use. It's very hard to tell if the microphone's bad or if it's our shitty earbuds. So whatever.
Yeah, you never know. Yeah. We found a thing to read. We're going to have something to say about it. Maybe it'll be short remarks. I don't know. Man. I was just saying, like, I had quite a long day, so I'm quite tired. So I'd quite like to just be like really withering in my critique of this essay, but I'm not actually sure whether I've got it in me or not.
We will probably
if I end up being like seeming insufficiently mean, it's not because for lack of like desire. It's just inability on this particular occasion. No, I don't mean to be too.
What I will say, I'm having a hard time because basically the point of this essay is kind of what it says is it's Fredy Perlman trying to explain why nationalism is more still, and he was writing this 30 years ago, but it still holds true today, probably more so, why it's still so much more attractive as an ideology to your average prole than I guess communism, and he has some, I think, good insights. I think he has some kind of, fairly typical anarchist insights, which we might get to. And then I think there maybe is just kind of some bad history in here, which there could have been some more citations and stuff like that. But maybe we just kind of skip over that. The one thing I'll say to start us off, I think, is I'm having a hard time holding in my head that this is the same person that wrote the introduction to Isaac Rubin's essays on Marxist theories of value.
I didn't realize that. Maybe because I think my copy doesn't have that introduction, and that's why I didn't recognize the name, perhaps. But
he translated it into English.
Okay.
And like when it was first published, I guess outside the Soviet Union, maybe that might not be true, but it was published in Canada, I think, and he translated it. And he wrote this like really excellent introduction where it's really clear that he has like an excellent understanding of specifically commodity fetishism, and like that, he makes the point, as Isaac Rubin does, where he's like, that is Marx's, if you understand that, you really begin to understand Marx's economics, because that is Marx's economics, right? Like his theory of commodity fetishism is a theory of a commodity economy. There are the kind of more humanist, more moral elements of commodity fetishism that, frequently or probably more frequently discussed, as opposed to like the actual material economic underpinnings of what makes commodity fetishism such a like excellent insight. And I'm having a hard time in my head.
That guy wrote this.
That guy wrote this because, like, yeah, this feels. I don't know. It doesn't feel like the same person. And the only other thing I know about Fredy Perlman is that he was quite influential to later primitivists. And I think Bookchin really didn't like him. Or no, not Bookchin didn't like him. I think Bookchin really didn't like the people that were influenced by him that became primitivists. And I think I don't think he was a primitivist, but I think you can see where the primitivists are coming from, maybe taking their influence from him a little bit in this essay in a way that I was like, that's the same guy? What? So yeah, I don't know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I sort of came away with the impression that basically his main critique in this essay is sort of like national liberation thinking. That's who he really wants to target as being like his main foil, you know. So at the beginning, he sort of makes these sort of like generalizations about the return of nationalism in general, or the fact that nationalism never went away. I mean, in some respects, his entire historiography of capitalism is actually just an analysis of the development of nationalism and nation states. It's almost like the history of capitalism is sort of channeled through a very particular understanding of the function of the nation state within the operations of capitalism. And on a certain level, there's not a huge amount to disagree with, like at least in terms of like certain aspects of the function of the nation state, and particularly a critique of people developing a nation of one's own as a route toward liberation, and mass sort of like confusing of the idea of socialism with the idea of nationalism, and how that sort of like is sort of just fails to recognize how, if you're developing a state, you're developing the apparatuses of operating and maintaining a capitalist system, I suppose. So there are certainly elements of what he is attempting to critique, which I have huge sympathy for. So I won't be too harsh, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, all of that stuff is just fairly unambiguously kind of just true, right? Where it's like the basis of a critique of nationalism, whether Marxist, anarchist, whatever. I did think the way he started this was actually kind of good, where he was like, it probably a bit outdated now, but he was like, there have been loads of times.
It was probably outdated in 1984.
Yes. Where he's like, there have been loads of times that nationalism as an ideology has been proclaimed dead. And one thing that I will say, he says this in the introduction, and then he doesn't really come back to it too much necessarily. He develops it, but he doesn't, I feel like, come back to it to make it kind of like a coherent, cool statement, where he says something like that nationalism is not a static ideology. It's constantly changing with the development of capitalism. And I think that there's really something there that could be like a really interesting study about like how, you know, the superstructural ideology of nationalism changes with the development of the forms of production under capitalism, right? Or accumulation, maybe. Like, I think that's a really interesting idea. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there were all these different times. He gives 3 examples where he's like, after World War I in Europe, everybody said we were finally at the end of this nationalist phase that maybe began in like, you know, the revolutions of the 19th century and kind of like ended, they would say, with everybody getting their own country, in brackets, in Europe, right? And then even then, obviously not really true. It was nationalism was proclaimed dead when the Bolsheviks did, as he says, their coup in Russia, right? Where he was like, the struggles for nationalism have ended. Now it's the struggle for, you know, the workers' struggle. And then in World War II, with the defeat of, you know, obviously like the fascists in Germany and the fascists in Italy, where the kind of, as he says, the like corollaries of nationalism being like genocide and just ethnic cleansing, like when that was laid bare for everybody to see, everybody said nationalism's, that was the last we're going to see of nationalism. But obviously that's not true. So that begs the question, right? It's like, why has it stuck around? And he asks, and he asks a question that's worth asking, which is like, why, now that everybody has seen that the corollary of nationalism is just like unmitigated violence and subjugation, like why are people seemingly more attracted to it? Again, a typical liberal question would be like, why are people not put off by it? He's actually just coming out and saying, well, actually, people are more attracted to it now that they know about that. So it's kind of the typical question of like, why do people fight for their own subjugation? Blah, 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 blah. But like I said, I think there's really the underpinnings of a really interesting research project there. And I guess, to be fair to him, like, you wouldn't expect it to be fully bored out in like a 7-page essay. So, whatever.
Yeah, he early on, it feels like his sort of the intellectual. I feel like there are almost two intellectual arguments that he's engaging with right at the start when he's trying to frame how the idea of nationalism versus the idea of imperialism, which are two things that like he's suggesting are often counterposed, and which he's sort of trying to unite or to merge, or suggest that imperialism is just a tendency within the sort of historical unfolding of the nation state, which, fair enough, I suppose there are tactics and repertoires that are common to both. I feel like the things he references as being what he is opposed to are Lenin's idea of like imperialism as the highest form of capitalism, which is an essay that I haven't read, so I can't say a huge amount about. And then also he sort of seems to be making reference to the ideas that we read about when we read some of Walter Rodney's book about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. What I learned from that is something that I'd never really reckoned with before, was that like imperialism in that modern capitalist form was a relatively recent phenomenon, right? Like he dates it as starting in the 1870s or whatever, that kind of period, 1870 through to like the First and Second World Wars, and then it's over by 1945, that kind of thing. And that's a similar thing that Lenin, I suppose, is trying to say, right? That like the growth of capitalism and the growth and accumulation of capital wealth and economic growth in the sort of like core continental European powers has led to this imperial process, and a process where finally at a certain point in their development they're able to like completely overwhelm any remaining opposition in other parts of the world and fully subjugate them. And then you get the scramble for Africa and whatever, and drawing borders all over the world. That's a sort of like historical analysis that I feel quite comfortable with, just because it's grounded in an understanding of the development of capitalism, how capitalism is growing, how it's encountering limits and attempting to overcome those limits and overcome crisis. Perlman's response, I feel like, is a fairly sort of trite one, which is to say, well, don't you know that there's always been empires? He doesn't go straight to Rome, fortunately, but sort of like
he does get there.
He does
eventually
get there. But he gets to Rome through like the sort of middle-aged Chinese Empire and the sort of Islamic Empire and the empire of which he sort of centers around Roman Catholicism, and sort of the sort of like papal Catholicism as the center of European empire, I suppose, with no real recognition for what I would be looking for in that instance is, okay, well, how were these various states economically organized? What were their class relations? What was the relationship to a productive class, and what was the nature of exploitation in these states, and
why did they feel the need to grow?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then how do we differentiate them from capitalist empire, or capitalist nation states? And now Perlman does subscribe to a thesis of historical development, and so it's not to say that like it's totally ahistorical, and he's not saying that like the British Empire is exactly the same as the Roman Empire because they just have the word empire in them. And we can sort of get onto his like theory of history, I suppose, because that is one that we have come across before and will recognize, or the listener will recognize. But yeah, it felt in some ways, if not ahistorical, then definitely counter to any historical analysis that at least I've come across the ones that I appreciate more, kind of thing. And ones that would be properly Marxist, particularly for somebody who, as you say, wrote an introduction to one of the best introductions to Marx's Capital.
Yeah, who knows more than us?
Yeah, well, there you go. Like... Well, maybe we should just give up now.
Yeah.
How are we ever supposed to understand any of this?
Maybe this is like him mirroring Murray Bookchin's like crotchety old man phase, where he stopped being like a materialist. Was just like, it's the fucking crust punks. Maybe it's just him being like, I don't know, dude. It's. Did you see, by the way, one of his footnotes was him hassling Jay Sakai? It's so funny. He said, the footnote is something like, I have before me a copy of whatever, like the mythology of the white proletariat, whatever that fucking book is called. And I was just like, I don't know, I would love to be in a room where Fredy Perlman is reading that book and being like, yeah, this is bad. Anyway, I think you're absolutely right. Also, his understanding of, I think, Rome and the Praetorian Guard, I think, is also quite bad, because he kind of tries to make the point that like the Praetorian Guard were like, scheming eunuchs basically, and like controlling the throne from behind the scenes. It's like, I see what he's saying, because like, there were moments like where they just made Claudius emperor, or when they killed Pertinax, and just, which is so funny, like they just, gave it to the highest bidder. But that wasn't like exercising political control necessarily. That was just like making money and through using their like weight to just pick the next person. But there was obviously still like other political structures there. Anyways, this isn't an essay on the Praetorian Guard. I think all of your points are definitely correct. There's a lot of muddying of terms here, in terms of, as you say, like they were all called empires. We call them all empires. So there's no real need to like differentiate why, like one of the big questions I'd really like eventually to kind of get to on the show is like, were the early colonial exploits capitalist in nature? You know what I mean? Or were they like remnants of a maybe dying mode of production? Was there something in like tributary modes in Europe, specifically like Western Europe, that made them want to go and like conquer the Americas, stuff like that? There's not really a lot of reckoning with that here. It's just kind of like empires and states are all kind of the same. And it begs like the big question here, which is, you can hassle Lenin all you want, and we'll get to that. But like the national liberation stuff is really, it's a lot more complicated, I think, than he's making it here, because it's like, what were you going to do? Tell like Angola that it couldn't have its own country because they don't have councils. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, it's really difficult, because on one hand, you do want to be principled and be like, there isn't really going to be real freedom. And there were obviously plenty of people in these places all over the world that were saying stuff like this. You're never really going to have real freedom while the social relations of capitalism exist, even if you weren't like, a political colony anymore. But you also don't want to be like a teleological person and be like, you have to get to this stage of having your own nation state. But I don't know. I just find it really hard, really, really hard to make a convincing argument like against national liberation fully, because it's like, well, yeah, obviously you'd want to get rid of the Germans. Obviously you'd want to get rid of your English colonial overlords. Obviously you'd want to do this. And like, I don't know, as bad as things have continued to be for like, large parts of the underdeveloped world, it's like, getting rid of the Belgians was good too. You know what I mean? It's like, I get it. I get that you want to be the smart person that's like, well, it's still capitalist, but it's like, I just always find it a bit, problematic when those arguments are made. I don't know.
Yeah, it feels broadly that his outlook is very voluntarist. Like everybody everybody in this, he presumes, knows exactly what they're doing and are intentionally doing something deceptive. Like if you set out to be the leader of a revolution, or I don't know, like be a national leader of some sort, or even just fight in a campaign of national liberation, or God forbid, like it set out to be a dissident within like Tsarist Russia and reckon with that political system, and like it feels like a theory of human agency which suggests that everybody has full grasp of all historical sort of events that are going on. There's really no place for historical contingency or events outside of people's control. Like this is skipping around a bit, so like maybe I shouldn't hone in on it too much, but like his critique of Lenin is like ludicrous. And like like Lenin made some mistakes, and may have been a bad person, maybe. I mean, I'm not in a position to even want to necessarily like pass judgment on the character of Lenin, but like the characterization of him as being a purely sort of duplicitous figure, knowing
as
exactly what
Hitler.
kind of state. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's no difference between Hitler and Lenin.
Yeah, I feel like that stuff, let's just talk about that now, because exactly like what you're saying, his critique of Lenin and Mao and Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler is all the exact same. And it's one that I think, you could find attractive if you were willing to abstract to this degree and just be like, all of those political projects were about, what does he say? Like disciplining the weak bourgeoisie and doing what the weak bourgeoisie couldn't do. It's like, okay, if that's how you define their political projects, sure, you're right. They're all Hitler. You know what I mean? But like, yeah, I think it's a confusing of the kind of like individuals who are involved in these with the kind of like large historical and material forces that were giving them their theater of operations. Because it's like, I know we've said this before in the show, it's like, despite potential disagreements we might have with like a lot of the Bolsheviks about what communism is, it's like they all were communists. It's like none of them really set out to be like, with okay, maybe the possible exception of like Stalin or something, but like none of them really set out to be like, and then we're going to massively industrialize and put everybody in gulags so that we can all do this. It's like, that's not a very nuanced understanding of what happened. And just like, yeah, comparing him to Hitler, because Hitler also was unhappy with like the military leaders and the political leaders in Weimar Germany. Like, it's very weak. It's very weak history. But, I have what I will say is I've always been really open to the idea that if you abstract away from what everybody wanted to do in, communist China, in the Soviet Union, and all these different places, what they all wound up doing was what the liberal regimes couldn't, which is like, quote unquote, like modernize and industrialize their countries, right? And in a process of trying to build up a material base for socialism, because that's how they thought it worked. It wasn't necessarily like a social thing for them necessarily. It was more of a like, let's just get to this point and then everybody owns everything, ... question mark, right? Like putting aside their intentions, which I do believe for a lot of these people were good, at least at the beginning, like there is a way of viewing this history where it's like, well, purpose of a system is what it does. All of these communist revolutions did wind up failing, and what they wound up doing is what the liberal regimes couldn't. So in the 20th century, like, unfortunately, the role that communism did play was to like fully subsume the world to capitalism. But the thing about that analysis is that it's completely ahistorical, because it completely like minimizes the actual content of communism to be so meaningless, or to be so empty that it's just meaningless. Because it's like, either you have a definition of what communism is and it's progressive and utopian and great and a classless society, or you don't. You know what I mean? It's like you don't just get to say communism is a classless society with, rational like planning for use and no exchange value, no law value or whatever. But it's also what the Leninists were doing, and it failed. It's like you can't really do that. Those are two completely different things. So like while I am sympathetic to the idea that it's like this strategy that Leninists and eventually like Maoists undertook led them to the same place that the liberal regimes, whether it's the Kuomintang or Kerensky's government or whatever, like wanted to get to. There's a whole lot of like ellipses going on there for like how those things actually happened. And it's like you're not really doing anyone any service by being like Mao, Hitler, Lenin, Mussolini. You know what I mean? It's like I get it, but kind of weak.
Yeah, I mean, it just forgets that there is a historical process. Like bringing about communism is a historical process. Nobody knows how to do it. Like we could say they made mistakes. People said they made mistakes at the time. It's not like they did these things for total lack of an alternative. But they were constricted in what they were able to do. There was only one proven model. There were certain historical and geopolitical pressures, and like we know where we can claim to know why we ended up where we ended up.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean that it had to be thus, and it definitely doesn't mean that everybody always intended to end up in exactly the same place as they did end up from the beginning.
Yeah. I think so. So the basis for all of this is that he claims that Marx has this blind spot, he calls it. Doesn't elaborate as much on that as I'd want him to. And that isn't necessarily like a critique. It's more so because I'm just kind of interested in what he's trying to say, which is that Marx didn't develop, he says, I think this is what he's saying, because I'm a bit confused. So just jump in if you think I'm getting this wrong. Mm-hmm. I think what he's saying is that Marx didn't develop a theory of primitive accumulation enough. And because of that, it was really easy to misconstrue and misapply what he did write about primitive accumulation for people like Lenin to just like in a really evil way be like, oh, so that's what we need to do. We need to primitive accumulate, putting aside the whole fact that it's like Marx only wrote about primitive accumulation in Capital because he was writing a critique of political economists that had come before him. And that's all they wanted to talk about. And so he like begrudgingly talked about it, but like really grounded it in how horrible it is. I do find it very hard to say that Marx had a blind spot on primitive accumulation when the whole last part of Capital is him being like, primitive accumulation, so-called primitive accumulation is like the most evil thing that's ever happened, and is like very clear about how evil, the colonization of Africa and, the Americas was. Kind of hard to make that point. But I don't know, maybe I get what he's saying. I don't know.
I mean, I guess. I mean, we read that last chapter of Capital. I sort of defer to you as the greatest scholar of Marx.
We've read the last chapter of Capital.
But no, I mean, I say that only to say that my reference points for these things has always been and continues to be Ellen Meeks's Wood's book on the origins of capitalism. Yeah, I mean, it's that, right? It's this suggestion that Marx strategically or deliberately, either out of omission or ignorance, avoided fully elaborating an idea of primitive accumulation. And also the suggestion that Marx was too sympathetic with the bourgeois political desire to overcome feudalism, overcome the arbitrary rights of feudal leaders, and in its place to install the sort of rights of the Enlightenment that we recognize, the French Revolution and whatever. So like he's also saying that Marx was too sympathetic to sort of like liberal bourgeois Enlightenment thinking, and as a something that Marx adopts alongside that is a sympathy with the political project of building nation states, I guess, or building state capacity, building states based on that particular set of norms, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I like. I think that's probably true. I mean, obviously Marx's ideas developed, so like there were different times when he has different attitudes toward these things. He's more of a co-traveler of the sort of like liberal enlightenment early on, and maybe his ideas change a little bit as he gets older. But I mean, I guess it's one of those things where like I have to caveat by saying, this is just my understanding of these things. But like, I feel like the point of the disagreement here is actually quite fundamental in terms of how we understand capitalism to be functioning, or how we understand the origins of capitalism to have come about. My understanding has always been that for Marx, the idea of primitive accumulation is about instilling in feudal populations the social relations necessary for the full development of capitalism, not as Perlman seems to be understanding, as he basically suggests that it's the Soviet theoretician Preobrazhensky that develops this idea of primitive accumulation as it's commonly understood, i.e., the plundering of, I don't know, any resources, I suppose, necessary to supply sort of people with the desire to do capitalism with the initial early inputs to allow for the circulation of capitalism to begin. It's almost this understanding of capitalism that says capitalism starts with investment. You've got to have capital to invest in production to have your return plus a surplus kind of thing. That's not really my understanding of how capitalism begins. Like, my understanding would, because that presupposes a group of people that want to do capitalism, I suppose, and like set out to with. It's coming back to a similar kind of voluntarism, right? Like everything is defined by the outcome read backwards into history kind of thing. Like, just because we got to X place, all the people that made decisions that got us there were always doing it intentionally. And that sort of feels like what we're getting here is a version of the development into capitalism, which starts with people who want to do that. Whereas I guess I've always thought about the origins of capitalism as a change in the relationship to class relations vis-a-vis how people are valuing labor and the transformation of labor into a commodity in and itself, so that you end up with a class of landlords who are actually interested in disciplining their workforces and increasing their productivity, which is a hallmark of a fundamental change in the relationship between people, rather than the sort of like growing of wealth in just for the sake of reinvestment kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that kind of idea is how you should begin a criticism of Lenin. And again, I think when we talk about Lenin, it's really hard to talk about him because a lot of the times when he was writing, especially, well, like obviously, basically what I mean is his later works, it's like, especially some of his more well-known ones like The State and Revolution and stuff, it's like he was caught up in events that he was kind of having to kind of justify, you know what I mean, as events were unfolding around him and as the strategy of the Bolsheviks like changed. So it's kind of not really worth like talking about him as, this person that like decided the fate of the free world and the Soviet Union even, right? Like, because again, like, obviously he was acting in a given set of historical circumstances, and what he was trying to do with his party was changing all the time, right? But what you were saying kind of got me thinking, where it's like, if you want to criticize this idea of, you need to have a primitive accumulation of wealth, even more so than we have under capitalism, to get to this high stage of communism. Well, you do need to have more of an understanding, more in line of what you're saying, Dan, of Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, which is one of social relations, right? Like, Smith and all of these different political economists that came before Marx were really trying to make a quantitative argument for what primitive accumulation was. It's like, once we had enough wealth plundered from the from the New World and siphoned off from the Catholics who were royalty, who were just like frittering it away on swimming pools or whatever, and the good Protestants got involved, then they were able to use all this money to do capitalism. It's like, Marx is not saying that. Marx is, obviously saying that this was an accumulation of social relations that came about in a given set of historical circumstances. I think you could also apply the exact same logic to a development of communism. The question is, which I'm not going to get into now, is like, how do you develop those social relations within capitalism, whatever. But I think that is where Perlman probably should have started his critique of Lenin, where it's like, there's not a lot of meat on the bone here to, I think, what Perlman is saying, because he's basically just saying, look at what happened, wasn't that bad. It was always going to be bad the whole time through, which maybe it was, like, I don't know, maybe it was. But like, again, we've talked about Lenin's misreading of the Critique of the Gotha program before, when we did the State and Revolution, where he's trying to say that there's this lower stage of communism and the higher stage, which is kind of like, broadly speaking to him, a quantitative thing where it's like, once we have enough wealth, once we industrialize enough, once we nationalize enough industries, then, once everybody's rich, we can all stop working or something like, or you'll be happy to work or something like that. And that'll be high communism. Whereas what Marx was saying is that low communism and high communism from the point of view of the social relations, it's the same mode of production. It's the exact same thing. What changes is just how people relate to production and distribution in terms of how they feel about work, how much material wealth there is, right? But that's kind of like a side question, and how much work actually needs to be done, how we actually kind of think about what work is. But yeah, again, Perlman, I think here kind of falls a little bit flat, because he's just taking kind of like what Lenin and a lot of these people are saying at face value and abstracting it away from kind of history and just being like, yeah, this guy's Hitler because, he wanted to do industry, and Hitler was mad at, like, I don't know, the SPD or something like that. It's like, yeah, again, kind of weak. Mm-hmm. Is there much else to say, you think, on his criticism of Lenin?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, I was thinking about expanding it about a little bit, just to emphasize how far he takes this argument.
Yes.
in general, in terms of like the function of the nation state and what it is, right? Like, if he recognizes the development of capitalism purely as a sort of growing force of accumulation, primitive accumulation in the form of expropriation from without, in the form of like, but I suppose both in the form of various imperial ventures, whether it's in South America or Africa or what have you, or also in terms of the sort of plundering of untapped internal resources in a state. So he sort of recognizes that, like, if you're a nascent developing nation state and you want to find inputs for the capitalist process, but you don't have access to sort of other parts of the world to plunder in the form of colonies or sort of like whatever, then you might look internally and say, well, who's got the wealth, what forces, what communities are there that could be exploited, who could be criminalized and put into penal servitude, who could be made a slave, who could just be eradicated and have all their assets turned over to be state property and therefore inputs to capitalism. But basically, he recognizes the only function of the nation state as being one which is to fulfill this basic need of capitalism, which is to have ever expanding new inputs to its production process. And so it sort of makes from the idea of like needing primitive accumulation for capitalism both to come about but then to continue to exist, you then need a force to actually implement that process of primitive accumulation. That's the nation state. And so the development of the nation state is intimately tied into the process of the development of capitalism, and therefore anybody who is engaged in any kind of state building project at all is de facto in hoc with capitalism and that process of accumulation, genocidal expropriation, whether you're Hitler or Mao or Lenin or Ronald Reagan or I don't know, Donald Trump or whoever. Like, it's just all the same. It's all the same thing, or Emperor Claudius or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I mean, it's funny.
I go a bit,
He very astutely does not name anyone like, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of more like third worldists that aren't Mao, right? Like he doesn't name anybody who you would be very like, oh, really? Like you're gonna hassle them?
I thought we liked Che Guevara,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, something like that.
Not even that. There's got to be somebody
like Amilcar Cabral. I mean,
in some ways,
like that,
yeah,
right?
but the people actually beyond reproach are just killed by the CIA.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, he's not like Lenin, Hitler, and Patrice Lumumba, right? Like that would be weird.
Yeah. Too far.
Yeah. But I mean, there is a way of making this point in a much better way. And you can make it in a Marxist sense too, right? Which is like, it's a strategic question though. It's like, if your goal is to just take over the state and then somehow change the social relations of society, you're putting the cart before the horse, right? You're saying that like the state and the political forms determine the economic base of society, and that's backwards. It's the economic base. I'm not going to get into what that actually means for a strategy, but that seems obviously true to me. This is still obviously like, I mean, I was excited when Zoran won, the mayoral race, right? Like I was excited when, yeah, he's literally Hitler. But like, I don't know. My point being that it's like, it's obviously true that if you're trying to have a socialist strategy that is you use as your goal like a coup, you know what I mean? It's like, well, odds are against you succeeding there. I'm not going to say I know what the answer is in that sense, but like you can make this point in a much better way. He's just making it, and I think being quite flippant, and it's the kind of anarchist knee-jerk reaction to states, right? It's like, yeah. And one thing I will say actually is when he's talking about Bakunin in this, he was really quite good, because he didn't do the typical anarchist thing of when he's talking about the first international being like, and Bakunin was obviously right, and Marx was literally being Hitler because Marx and then Lenin and then everybody dies, right? Like he does make the point. He said, actually, I kind of want to read this sentence. Let me see if I can find it, because he says, oh yeah, here it is. He says, Bakunin and his followers were unambiguous in their rejection of all states, but they were also ambiguous about capitalist enterprise. It's like, finally an anarchist says that. It's like, yeah, it's like, great, good for you, Bakunin. You don't want states. You just want everybody to be a petty producer and then reproduce capitalism, but in a much less stable way, right? It's like, yeah, I appreciated that, at least, where it was like, yeah, a nod to
maybe, but I'm almost surprised Perlman isn't like, well, as long as they don't want states, then it's not capitalism, so it's fine.
We want anarchist trade unions and anarchist firms, right? Yeah, exactly. It's like,
I don't know.
Whatever. I did his take too. He says that was the first international. Then he says something like the second international came to terms with the state, and then the third international just made the state their goal. I thought that was really good. It's like, oh yeah, well, fair enough. Like.
Yeah, I almost wanted to raise a defense of Lenin, which was like, well, Lenin just like was following the political strategy that was the universal political strategy of the established left, but then everybody but Lenin betrayed it. Lenin was the last social democrat, and then had to find something, and totally failed when it came to defining what an alternative form of strategy would be vis-a-vis, developing a political entity, I suppose, that could be described as socialism.
Yeah, I mean,
Perlman's argument would be, well, Lenin just learned that the Second International fetishized the state as much as, and then Lenin and maybe that's maybe that's the case. Maybe that's what Lenin and the other Bolsheviks couldn't escape from their inheritance of the Second International Social Democracy, was like a commitment to building the productive apparatus of capitalism with the hope of I don't know, developing toward communism, I suppose. But then I'm inclined to be sympathetic in the sense that it's not entirely obvious what they should have or could have done alternatively.
We could say that the legacy of social democracy just wound up being like a Blanquist coup.
Yeah.
But I mean, also, there's like a 0% chance you and I wouldn't have been social democrats at the turn of the century, right? It's like, because that would have just been seen as how you got to socialism. Like, because obviously, hey, look at the SPD. You know what I mean? It's like the war credit stuff had yet to happen. 1905, I guess, had yet to happen, even like in Russia. But I mean, I don't know. All of this skirts around the question of whether or not communism, as we understand it, would have been possible in like 1917 Russia or mid 20th century China. And I mean, if you want to say, if you want to be pessimistic about it, you would just say no, because like the entire rest of the world was planning on invading both of these places if they didn't industrialize immediately. I mean, maybe that's like too, forgiving for these regimes. I mean, it was just so chaotic that it's like, sure, I guess you could have had the social relations of communism instituted then if everybody became a councilist immediately in their workplaces somehow. Yeah, I don't know. It's also, I'm also just like,
so I mean, that much as we might like the blueprint drawn up for us by the group of international communists, that was predicated on a general shift in the, I don't know, general political consciousness of the proletariat. It wasn't
specifically the proletariat.
The
reason I say that is because like most of these places were majority peasant, right?
Well, there you go. Yeah, true. Yeah. But especially it couldn't be something that was implemented, by the Bolsheviks top down,
Yeah. If only Lenin, this is my volunteerism, if only Lenin had just listened to Jan Appel, everything would have been fine. Yeah, I don't know. I think when is this conversation going to be like, when can we move on from the conversation about like debates over, the Soviet Union and communist China? It's like, realistically, like, I think since reading that Isabel Guerrero book where she was like, really do your best to not fetishize one organizational strategy because these are all historically specific things, like especially the Social Democratic Party. I think I've just been like,
over it.
It's like, I'm kind of over it, but I'm kind of just like, well, what bearing does this have anymore? You know what I mean? Like to claim that you could do a social democratic movement like the Bolsheviks tried to do, and in some ways kind of succeeded for a while in the Soviet Union, or in Russia, I guess I should say, like, and the Germans kind of wound up failing doing before that. Like, that's one thing, but it's also funny to think that you could even do like a coup in any way, like the Bolsheviks wound up doing. It's like, well, that's even more laughable. So it's like, I don't know. I'm over it. That's what I'm saying. Kind of over it. I'm over the debates. It's like, whatever. Have your opinion. I don't care. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So how should we talk about the Soviet Union?
How should we talk about it? You know what we should do is we should read Renegade Kautsky. That's what we should do. That will put all of this to bed. We'll do that. What did Lenin actually? Two liberals fighting. What did he actually think?
Two statists, two Hitlers go to war.
Hitler. I mean, I just remembered we did read the Polmatic where he was like from Marx to Hitler.
Oh yeah,
Karl Kautsky from Marx to Hitler. So,
well, we've already studied establish
so
Kautsky's credentials as a Hitler. Maybe today we've established Lenin's credentials similarly so.
I don't know why I find that so funny. It's just like they're all Hitlers. Maybe that's just my take. Maybe I stop caring and just call them all Hitlers. Whatever. Just just a few other things just that I kind of wanted to mention. I thought one thing that he did in this that was quite good, where he was like, he said two things. He said, in a lot of times when there was a process of early nation building, specifically in like America, and then in a weird way, he kind of said it also about what like Zionists have done to or attempted to do to Palestine. He says that there's like a really interesting projection of nations where they don't exist onto people that these nations are trying to demonize and get rid of. So in the American context, it's like there were these conspiracies about, Tecumseh or like, different leaders of quote unquote nations that wanted to overthrow American values, these savages trying to destroy everything. And he's doing the kind of like questionable anarchist thing where he's just being like, hey man, they were really like, they were just all anarchists. You know what I mean? Like if you ever think about it, it's like all native peoples are just anarchists. And it's like, okay, putting that aside, it is an interesting point to say about like the projection of very evil nation building values in something like a metropole get mirrored in kind of like a negative way onto the people that they're subjugating. I thought that was quite interesting. And then he kind of goes on from there to say like, when you create a nation, quote unquote, it's not like an enshrinement of commonalities that everybody can like, in the vein of the Enlightenment, like, be happy about, like, fraternity and, liberty and all this stuff. He's like, actually, it's the mass destruction of a million different cultures. I thought that was pretty compelling. I thought that was a very good point. It was very interesting. It was like, you're papering over a million different like cool cultures that existed even amongst like the white workers in the early like colonies in America, like to create something that just serves the needs of capital. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean that was the most compelling bit to me as well, when he was, again, this is coming back to what you said near the beginning, where he's making the assertion that nationalism or nation building or a nation or a nation state is not just like a set of attributes, but like a process or a so like he makes this assertion that like the nation state and what it will be is evident in Napoleonic post-revolutionary France, and it's evident in the development of the early United States. And he says, well, neither of one of those wasn't a nation state; it was an empire, and one of them was not united by any common set of values in a way which we would normally recognize a nation state to be. But I found it interesting to be like, don't look at a nation state and see a common language or a common culture or something, but a particular process. Now, his process is a sort of like genocidal process of developing capitalism, which, I mean, for all the critiques that we've leveled against it, I mean, that's not an unreasonable modus operandi to apply to capitalist states, I suppose. And we're going to continue to see it. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you could read the title of this essay in the context of today. Obviously, this was written in 1984, and in a lot of ways, as we've said, sort of like targeted toward how the left, or sort of people, co-travelers of the left, had developed the idea of nation building. But you could take similar elements and read them into the world today. Like, what is the relationship between modern empire and modern nation states, nation building, nationalism? Is Trump doing nationalism or is he doing imperialism? Like, now I'm just throwing words around, but
no, good point. Yeah, for I think his lack of actually doing this, he does make a good point. Exactly like what you're saying, which is you do need to be specific in your understandings of these nationalisms, because even though he's saying they're all the same, they're all Hitler, it's like there are real differences in the ways that these operate and the reasons that they're operating, right? Like, and that has strategic
and historical phases for that operation, I suppose. Like it's doing certain things at certain periods and not others, and you have to read the particular historical context. Yeah, I suppose.
I'll leave that up to somebody else.
No, somebody else. Yeah.
Somebody else can do that one.
Yes. Much as we're not going to say what the social relations of communism are.
We're not going to say much. We're not going to say anything about the past. We're not going to say anything about the future. Rarely about the present as well.
Yes.
All right.
Did
you watch any
Rubin? Is that our recommendation?
Yeah. Go read his introduction to Isaac Rubin. Did you watch any of Trump's speech at Davos by any chance?
No.
Listen to it?
No.
It was.
Maybe I should go and do that.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. It was so upsetting. It was such a bummer. The only reason I mentioned it is because it was very funny.
I just like listen to Mark Carney and stroke my liberal beard.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you need to have your favorite liberal in times like these. You know what I mean? Liberal that's slowly being radicalized. Like, the only reason I mentioned it is because it was very funny. He was talking all
next
this
time
shit.
you see him, he's got a little red book in his pocket.
Yeah, exactly. They always become Maoists, don't they? Interesting.
We're going from the Maoist to neoliberal pipeline and switching it round. It's the neoliberal to Maoist pipeline.
Interesting times indeed. Maybe we should pick up that Jay Sakai.
Yeah.
The only reason I mentioned the Trump speech is because it was very funny because he talked all this, big talk about Greenland. And then at the end, he went and had this meeting and everybody just told him to fuck off. And he was like, I have agreed. There is an agreement in place. And everyone was like, no, there is not. Fuck off. We're not doing this. And it was just like, all right, well, it made me, after reading The Heat Wave, it made me, where there was that, I think it was the Schwang piece where they were just like, it's not going to work. So whatever. I was like, oh, so we're in for a long, slow decline instead. Okay. I was worried it was just going to be like tomorrow, but like, yeah. Slow decline.
The system's gotten too big. Nobody can,
Yeah.
Slow decline it is.
Slow decline it is. Whatever. All right. Well, maybe we should read something we don't fully agree with more often because I actually wound up enjoying this. This was fun.
Yeah, it's been fun. Yeah, I've enjoyed this. Hope everybody's enjoyed listening. Thanks for reaching the end if you're here with us still.
All right. Talk to you later, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out and much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.